Thank you very much, Vivi, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel of global regulation. And I guess everyone can see evidently this is an all-star panel of lawyers and very experienced lawyers here based in New York City and Washington, D.C. First of all, let me kick off this panel by introducing myself. My name is Sheng Wang. I used to be a lawyer at one of the leading law firms here in New York City, White & Case. Now I'm the co-founder and also the general counsel of the blockchain company called Quantum Continent, headquartered in Shenzhen. So I will ask, since in view of time, I will ask questions directly to our panelists. And when each one of our panelists, they answer the question, they will first give a brief introduction about yourself and also your company. So since we're talking about the regulation, and in this past 2 to 3 years, we have already been witnessing, and we're going to continue witnessing the vicissitudes of the blockchain world. And the first question is, could you please compare the US regulation environment with the regulation environment of the rest of the world? For example, our ambassador of Malta has already presented the regulation and also investments environments of Malta. Could you please address the US regulation in general, US regulation environment compared with the rest of the world? And whoever wants to answer, please go ahead.
Well, so hi, I'm Captain Cooper. I'm a shareholder at River. I am a lawyer who's been practicing financial services law with a specialty in derivatives and futures contracts. And so I've come to this space from that kind of but to answer your question, I think there are certain jurisdictions overseas that are significantly ahead of us in terms of giving guidance. So you just heard from Malta, Gibraltar, you have Bermuda. I think Malta is probably the furthest along. You have FINMA in Switzerland, who gave some guidance. It's all very helpful. But we're just not. We need guidance that comes from the federal level, and so far that just hasn't really happened very much. Now.
Thank you. My name is Victor Samuel. I've been in the financial services industry as a regulatory attorney for about 20 years now. And my expertise is really on high-frequency trading systems, market structure, across asset classes, and also AML. So we go in and we set up regulatory compliance structures within banks, broker-dealers, and now fintech and regtech as well. So we advise them, and in some cases we also take an equity position, and we also advise. So to your question about how do we compare the U.S. regulatory structure with what's happening globally, I think that we're not further along, neither are we holding back the industry. I think some of the non-movement, the non-progress that you see in the U.S. Regulatory environment is actually helping us in certain ways rather than hurting us, because there's a lot of ICOs, a lot more ICOs that were issued out of the U.S. than anywhere else. So that continues to be the case. We haven't come out with any pronouncements that's actually killing this industry. We could do a lot more in terms of AML, in terms of anti-money laundering rules and regulations, in terms of just guidance regarding market structure on the security side. I think we could do a lot of that, but I think you will see that over the next couple of years. And I think it has to be a thoughtful approach, because a lot of the world is looking at U.S. regulation in order to decide what to do themselves. So that's my opinion.
Hi, I'm Stephen Rutenberg. I'm with Polsinelli. We're a 800 lawyer firm with about 20 offices throughout the United States, and a very active group representing lots of parties in this space. And I'll just add to both of those last two comments that one of the primary differences, at least when it comes to taking money from investors between the U.S. and the rest, and a lot of the other jurisdictions in the world, is the U.S. regulators are very focused on investor protection. I mean, that is probably one of the key areas that U.S. regulators focus on, more than even anti-money laundering, more than other things. If you want to understand a lot of some of the caution and some of where the regulators are moving here, is to think that the U.S. regulations really came out of an environment of protecting investors. The SEC was founded kind of during the Depression based on state laws that were anti-fraud laws. And that's really what U.S. regulators are thinking about, often more than other things. And in that light, a lot of things seem to make more sense of the U.S. approach.
Hi, good morning. I'm Joel Teltner. I head the FinTech and Blockchain practice at the law firm Sullivan Worcester. And there's an interesting aspect to your question, because whenever we start to talk about comparing the U.S. regulatory regime to other countries, there's a presumption underlying that question that if we can find the right regime and we organize and locate our ICO from that particular jurisdiction, everything will be okay. And so one of the things I think it's important to remind everybody when we have this type of conversation is that regardless of whether you end up going to a jurisdiction like Malta, and Malta is doing great things in this space, by the way, but it doesn't solve necessarily all of your problems or challenges that you have to deal with. So you can go to Malta, you can structure your ICO from Malta, you can get regulatory approval by Malta, but you still have to comply with the regulatory considerations in the jurisdictions where your investors are located. And so you can't simply by going to a jurisdiction, you get the blessing from that jurisdiction, be home free as far as all of the other places where your investors or buyers might be located. And it's just important to keep in mind.
Just one note, as we consider the regulatory environment around the world, I think it's very important, at least from my I didn't introduce myself, sorry. Angela Wilson. I am a co-founder of DLX Law. Prior to co-founding DLX Law, I was the general counsel and chief legal officer of Digital Asset Holdings, which is one of the earliest adopters of blockchain technology for enterprise systems, and is the one that is putting the Australian Stock Exchange clearance and settlement system to be done via blockchain technology software. So in my interactions with regulators around the world, I think that there's a very, very common theme that sometimes in the industry we forget about it. And that is that regulators do not regulate technologies. They regulate the application of the technology. And so as we as the regulators, as the legislators consider the different applications, I think we have to go back to kind of the principles and the application that this technology is being used for. And so I think in that sense, the world is flat, and it's very similar that the regulators are looking at, and they're not saying this way of doing this is better than doing it technology-wise than others. They're looking at it, how is this technology being implemented in an investor scenario? How is this technology being implemented in cybersecurity as you're thinking about implementation in enterprise systems and things like that?
Last but not least, Jonathan Dunsmore, founder of Dunsmore Law of Counsel Reading Wise. Real quick, as everybody else has said, you've got to play well together. If you mess up in the United States, you could possibly mess up everywhere else. And so it really benefits and behooves anybody who's trying to raise money from around the world that you protect yourself and you protect your investors. As everyone else has said on this panel, the SEC is very investor focused. And so if you do dirt here, they will find you, as we've seen, and don't do it. The U.S. right now is still one of the strongest capital markets, regardless of whether the crypto markets are bare right now. It is still very powerful. And so if you want access here, make sure you do it right, because they will get you.
Excellent points. There are a lot of very, very important takeaway messages from our all-star attorneys' presentations. So my next question, actually, I will switch the gear to dive a little bit deeper into the crypto world and also to the blockchain world. It's a term, it's actually everyone here in this audience is very familiar with, is the STO, Security Token Offering. So in this past couple of years, we have already witnessed the trend is from IPO to ICO, now from ICO possibly to STO. And could you please comment on the regulation trend of STO in the next couple of years, especially in the United States? Whoever wants to jump.
So I think, as my learned panel has mentioned, I think that as technology evolves, regulators are going to see how it behaves in the market, what it does to investors. I think using a blockchain to track stocks and transfer agent kind of mundane tasks that cost startups and companies a lot of money and is time consuming and kind of delays innovation is something that this industry really needs, and is my really kind of exciting, heart-racing thing, because a startup can work really hard and develop products and services out and then have the ability to offer it to the average investor under a Renegade Plus $50 million offering. And that's just unheard of. That type of access is just not something we're used to, and that's what I'm really looking forward to.
When we talk about security token offerings, it's important to understand that it can mean different things. On the one hand, there can be security tokens, which really are equities in a company that are simply being sold in tokenized form. A true equity that needs to comply with various security law requirements. But also in the world of security tokens, we use that concept to talk about tokens that are sold, at least in the US, on an exemption from security law registrations. So what people will talk about is a Reg D or Reg A offering or a Reg S offering outside of the United States. And for those types of tokens, because the SEC has expressed a view that many tokens may be securities, or at least initially may be securities, in order to avoid having to register those tokens, they're issued on an exempt basis. But it doesn't mean they're equity in the traditional sense. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily part of a company's capital structure. It doesn't mean that they necessarily give the holders a profit interest or right to dividends or even voting rights. And so we may have a lot of tokens out there that are called security tokens but aren't really securities in the traditional sense, but at the same time are being issued in a way that comply with security law requirements.
I think that's Joel's point is a very good one, and that's something I was telling somebody beforehand, that if you're talking about a security token in terms of the sense that it's basically what we're dealing with right now as being equity or some interest in a company, and the blockchain part of it is basically providing, as Jonathan said, a greater liquidity or a secondary market. The real driver there, I don't believe, is going to be the law, but it's going to be it's the market. I mean, you can do that under the Reg D exemptions right now, like any other private placement. The real question is, how do you have a secondary market that works, and is there a market for this? On the other hand, there are also things that people consider to be a security token, which are basically the utility tokens of last year, but utility tokens that comply with an exemption from securities laws. And it's very important that when people are talking about security tokens, they say whether or not it's the ledgering system, the secondary market for liquidity, which is great, and if that happens, I think we're all going to be extremely busy if those happen. Or is it stage 2 of utility token, or utility token 1918, or 2018? We're not having a Russian Revolution yet, but...
I think those are really solid points, and I think there's not much you can talk about securities tokens, except to say that, the current regulatory structure is what we have. So whatever it is that we're doing, we're digitizing an interest, a security interest, whatever it is, it has to follow with the existing structure that we currently have. So there is no new structure that's been built out yet, and that's what concerns me. So the idea is, are we tokenizing it in order for it to be more interesting in the secondary market? And that's the most important thing. Otherwise, what you have is what Stephen said. It's just a ledger system. So the idea is, how do we get this across into the secondary markets, and who are those market players, and how will they be regulated? That's much more interesting, I think, and that remains to be seen.
I would just add, so Joel brought up how many of these security tokens are not necessarily equity. I'm wondering when the SEC may be starting to find some of these things to be more like a debt security, an obligation to provide something in the future, which might be a better model for them or not. I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
All right, thank you very much for your very insightful comments. And then the third question, or the third talking point, and also is one of the main talking points for today's Mars Finance Summit, is actually on the stablecoin. As we know, the stablecoin has been very popular, especially particularly since September from the GUSD and also the USDT. Now I will go directly to Angela, because Angela, you are recognized widely as a leading expert on the stablecoin. So in this year, the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik, he also mentioned about interesting point about mechanism design. So my question to you and also to all of our panelists is it possible that we can do a mechanism design in the regulation regime to regulate stablecoin? And what are your thoughts? And what is the future trend, or in general, what is the future trend of regulation of stablecoins?
So I think the introduction earlier about the different varieties and the underlying systems of how people have designed and implemented stablecoins is extremely important. So we have the full reserve stablecoins, that's the Geminis and then Paxos and the Circle one, and those are, I consider them, and they are under the US regulatory regime, basically a representation, a dematerialized representation of the deposit account that is in a deposit that is in a regulated financial institution. So for all of them, there is a deposit account in a FDIC insured bank, and those points are backed up with 100% reserves, dollar for dollar. And then we have some of the other stable coins that are based on, where the reserves are being based on either a basket of commodities or a basket of cryptocurrencies and other things. And for those, it becomes a little bit more difficult to determine what regulations they are going to be under. So in the US, for example, going back to the regulatory front, we have a little bit of a fragmented regulatory regime in the United States, which makes it kind of difficult for people to understand where does a certain product fall and under which regulations. And the fact that you fall under one regulatory body doesn't mean every other regulatory body is excluded. And what I mean by that is the ability of some of these stable coins, what are they really representing? Some of them could be, derivatives. Some of them could be futures contracts, which would be under the CFTC's purview. A lot of them will actually have money transmission issues because they are using the network as, being a money transmitter under state laws. And so I think it all depends, and I'll let my other panelists, colleague panelists,
The fundamental questions for stablecoin are, one, should they be regulated like a fiat currency or something different? And for the market and industry in the space to go forward, I think the fundamental challenges are transparency and auditing, and will that happen on a regulatory basis, or are there ways to do that on a non-regulatory basis? I will give a quick plug that for a week from today in London, representatives of a number of the stable coins around the world are coming together to talk about whether or not it is feasible to form some type of self-governing or voluntary organization in which they can put together best practices and standards and work with regulators to come up with a comprehensive global regime. If you're interested in that conference, you can go to stable.report. It will take place again in London a week from today.
The only thing I would add is just, of all the things to keep in mind with stable coins, taxation and the IRS, how the IRS treats it, is something to keep in mind as well. I think there was, at a time, some of the interest in it came from the desire to be able to do kind-for-kind exchanges, which doesn't really work under the current tax code, but it did last year. So I think some of the initial interest came from that, which may not be applicable anymore. But one more thing to think about.
I have my views about stablecoin that I'll keep away from this panel, but having grown in this industry for quite some time, I've seen how various governments have tried to peg their currency and try to bring stability at the risk of, giving up your fiscal policy and your monetary policy. And you give that up when you create this peg, and that's what this is essentially. So the idea is, why do we have this stablecoin? Is it to stabilize something that is inherently unstable? So I think that the issue here is there is tremendous opportunities for arbitrage with stablecoin, and I'm expecting that that's going to kind of, as we see much more of mass adoption, I think that these arbitrage opportunities will disappear, and I think that's what's going to bring stability to the marketplace. It's not creating a stablecoin and then pegging it artificially. I don't think it really works. It doesn't work in efficient markets anyway. So that's just my opinion.
Yeah, to follow up on my earlier point, for the stablecoins issued by entities that aren't a bank or a trust company or somehow otherwise regulated and under those regulatory regimes may take deposits and have deposit accounts, I wonder if a stablecoin issued by someone other than that type of institution isn't really a debt security. If it's an IOU possible.
Last but not least, stablecoins worry me because they're super centralized. And so anytime you have really mass centralization, it's kind of anti-blockchain in a lot of ways. And so, until someone figures out not only the technology, but also the regulation side, everything is just theoretical at this point. And it doesn't matter how much math or how much tech is behind it. We don't even have an STO, let alone a damn stablecoin. And so I would love to attempt to run anything, and I would love to hear what these folks have to think about it, but it is just, that is a high bar to cross right now.
Perfect points. And last but not least, in view of time, I will quickly jump into the final topic of our panel, is the RegTech versus FinTech. As we all know, smart contracts is one of the main building block of the blockchain technology. The essential point of the smart contract is basically to computerize the legal contracts. Right. If you can computerize the legal contracts into computer code, you can also computerize the legal regulation into computer code. So that possibly can be the future of the regulation technology. So my question to the panelists here is that what do you think about the interplay between the FinTech and also the RegTech?
Real quick, if you're able to vote in the United States, vote in the United States, and that's all I have to say about this. I'll let my panel continue, but please do that.
That was a great plug-in. I think that there are two different ways that I think about RegTech. One of them is, how does the regulator actually translate the regulations into computer code and algorithms that help them function better as a regulator and as they're regulating and watching over the space. And the other one is RegTech from the point of the utilization, as in the companies who are trying to comply, and all of us that have these huge amounts of regulatory obligations. How do we automate some of those functions? How do we help produce the reports that the regulators are looking for in a much easier and better way? And with respect to the fintechs, the fintechs have, in my view, have always been the ones that are implementing, I'll call it, much better process flows in financial services. So it could be, interactions with consumers. It could be, new innovative products and services in the marketplace that could be introduced.
Blockchain technology is disruptive. It causes innovation at lightning speed, and when that happens, regulators get nervous because they don't know what they don't know. They don't really understand what's happening, and so there's an inclination at times to regulate to prevent bad things from happening. But when we start to talk about the interaction between RegTech and FinTech, the interesting thing about this marketplace is that there are a lot of solutions that blockchain technology provide that actually can help regulators regulate in a better, more efficient way. So I would encourage all of you, when you're out there building the next really cool project, to think about ways that blockchain can actually help to create a stable regulatory environment and bring regulators in as partners as opposed to looking at them as potentially the enemy.
Thank you. I think it's a great question. One of the most fascinating things, which I don't think we give enough thought to, is let's say all of this is successful with blockchain smart contracts governing a huge amount of how we deal with our lives. How do we want our regulations and regulators to look after that? And it brings up a whole host of moral and real questions. One is, who's going to do the enforcement? If you have a blockchain-controlled smart contracts governing enforcements throughout countries, is this kind of idea of a decentralized world really going to give a huge amount of power to the United Nations or some national, super governmental organization that's going to handle the enforcement? And that's one area that we're going to have to think about. What do we really want? How do we want that to look? Additionally, if you really start having all of your contracts automatically execute and not through a regulator and not, where does the ability of a human judge to say this is not fair come in? I mean, our legal system and our humanity for the last 5,000 years has really had a huge human element involved, in which there's always a judge, there's a system of pardons, there's a system of looking at the world and saying this is not fair, you know, we can do somewhat better. I mean, if we get rid of all that and it all happens automatically on some blockchain, is that really a better world? And even just practically, if all the contracts in 2008 would have automatically executed, we would have had a lot more transparency, but would have the effects of 2008 been a lot worse if all the derivative contracts would have, and I don't know the answer to that, but that's why we're going to need panels of more than 7 lawyers and ethicists, and we're going to really have to think through these things, because if we're successful here, there is going to be so many issues that to really preserve the humanity of our society.
So I disagree with Stephen. I think that a panel of 7 lawyers is more than enough for anything. So we can create the world or we can break the world. And we had some of that back in the coffee room up there. So that was a great question, and it's especially timely because fintech as a word entered the dictionary this year. And so what is fintech? If you think about it in the context of a rat and a rat trap, I would say fintech is a rat that's faster, you know, it's smarter, and that's what it's doing. It's bringing financial processes, it's dragging it to the modern technological age. What that means is it allows market participants to connect with each other faster in a decentralized way, and so you have to build a better mousetrap, whether that's internal in your control and compliance processes, or whether it's external, meaning market surveillance, market integrity, and regulatory auditing. They just have to build it better, and that's some of the issues that we're seeing in blockchain technology. Some of the reasons why, you know, none of the regulators really want to come forward and say, well, this works, or we're okay, or comfortable with this aspect of technologies, because they haven't figured out how to control it. And that's what they need. They need the ability to say, okay, we understand what this is, and we can protect the consumer, we can protect market integrity, we can do all of these other things that are social goods that they consider to be important. So that's it. Thank you for the time.
That's a great question. I agree that distributed ledger technology can be very helpful to the regulators, but again, putting on my former CFTC enforcement attorney hat, technology can be used for good or it can be used for ill. It's a bit of a technology arms race, I think, between folks who want to use it for ill and those who want to make sure they're fair and markets that have integrity. I am hopeful that distributed ledger technology can be quite helpful to regulators.
Evidently, it seems to me that the fintech versus regtech is a topic that everyone loves very much. So we can continue our conversation outside this conference room and with our all-star panelists. So in view of time, and I know we have another all-star panel moderated by Professor Henry Cao next to us. So let's give another round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much for your very insightful comments. And the conversation continues, doesn't stop. Thank you very much.